The room was already silent when I walked in. Not the ordinary quiet of people waiting for a meeting to start, but the deliberate kind where everyone had agreed without speaking that nothing unnecessary would be said aloud. The briefing room at Fort Bragg headquarters always felt colder than the rest of the building, even when the thermostat claimed otherwise. January in North Carolina shouldn't require this much Arctic precision. But here we were. I stopped at the edge of the conference table, heels together, back straight, hands where they belonged. 30 years of muscle memory made the position automatic, the way breathing happened without thought. My sister didn't look up right away. Major General Catherine Blackwood sat at the head of the table, uniform immaculate, rank stars catching the fluorescent light. 2 stars I had helped her earn. To her left sat the executive officer, some colonel whose name I'd already forgotten because it didn't matter. To her right, the legal liaison flipped through a thin folder, reading words he'd clearly memorized but pretended required fresh attention. The silence stretched. Catherine finally raised her eyes, and for half a second I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe, or regret. Then it vanished behind the professional mask she wore better than most people wore skin. Her voice came out steady, measured, completely devoid of warmth. No hesitation. No acknowledgement that we'd shared a bedroom for 18 years, that she'd taught me to ride a bike, that our father's uniform had hung in the same closet while we grew up pretending we understood what duty meant. The words arrived like bullets, clean, efficient, final. I was relieved of command, effective immediately. Persistent concerns regarding my leadership approach. Leadership approach. Not misconduct, not failure, not incompetence, just approach. A word so vague it could mean anything or nothing, depending on who needed it to mean what. I waited for elaboration, context, specifics, dates, incidents, examples, anything that would transform this administrative execution into something resembling due process. Nothing came. Catherine gestured to the empty chair across from her. I didn't sit. Sitting would make this feel like a conversation, and conversations implied both parties had something to contribute. This wasn't that. This was a script she'd written alone, and my role consisted entirely of standing here and accepting whatever came next. She read from prepared text, her eyes tracking across paper that probably said more than she was sharing. Only the highlights made it into the air between us, the part she wanted on record, the sanitized version. I would turn over command to my executive officer immediately. My access credentials would be updated today. I was reassigned pending further administrative review. Administrative review. The phrase hung there, ominous in its bureaucratic blandness. Code for, we're going to bury you in paperwork until you retire quietly and disappear. The legal liaison cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with whatever role he'd been assigned in this theater. He slid the folder across polished wood, and it made a sound like a door closing. I needed to sign. Acknowledgement of receipt. Standard procedure. The kind of form officers signed 100 times throughout a career without reading past the header. I stepped forward, took the folder, opened it. The executive officer shifted in his seat. Catherine's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough. They wanted this over. Quick signature, quiet exit, problem solved. I read every word. Not skimming, not scanning, reading. Each sentence, each clause, each reference and subparagraph and footnote that most people ignored because folders like this always said the same thing in the same language. And who had time to parse legalese when the outcome was already decided? I had time. I had all the time in the world because the next 30 seconds would determine whether this ended here or became something else entirely. Page 1. Standard acknowledgement language. Page 2. Reassignment details, location pending, duties to be determined. Page 3. Section 5, paragraph 3, subclause D. There it was, buried in the middle of administrative boilerplate that read like it had been copied from a template last updated in 1987. One sentence that changed everything. When an officer is relieved of command without documented cause consistent with regulatory standards, the action requires formal review to ensure compliance with Title 10 U.S.C. and DoD Directive 1320/04. I read it again, then once more letting each word settle. Catherine had no idea this clause existed. I could see it in the way she sat, confident and relaxed, as if the hard part was over, as if my signature would close this chapter cleanly, and she could move on to whatever came next in her carefully calibrated career trajectory. She didn't know that the military, for all its flaws, had built safeguards into the system. Mechanisms designed to catch exactly this kind of removal: the vague justification, the absent documentation, the exercise of authority that looked legitimate on the surface but crumbled under scrutiny. All it required was someone who actually read the paperwork. I signed where it told me to sign, initialed where it asked, dated each line with careful precision. Then I closed the folder and handed it back to the legal liaison, who accepted it with visible relief. Catherine watched the entire transaction, her face unreadable. She'd won, or thought she had. The removal order was signed. The command would transfer. The system would process this like it processed everything else, efficiently and without questions. She didn't ask if I understood, didn't offer explanations or justifications, didn't soften anything with the kind personal acknowledgement that might have made this feel less like an execution. When the folder disappeared into the legal liaison's briefcase, Catherine delivered her final line: dismissed. One word, formal, distant, the same word she'd use with any subordinate. I came to attention and saluted. She returned it automatically, muscle memory taking over where emotion had no place. Then I turned and walked out, each step measured, refusing to hurry or hesitate, or show anything resembling the devastation currently spreading through my chest like ink through water. The hallway felt longer than usual, not because anything physical had changed, but because I was suddenly aware of every sound, every person who didn't quite look at me, but definitely noticed. Word traveled fast in places like this. By now everyone knew. The colonel had been removed, leadership issues, details unclear, best not to ask. I didn't return to my office. That would mean facing my executive officer, Captain Emily Chen, who was probably already standing beside my desk, wondering what she'd done to deserve inheriting a command this way. I'd deal with that later. Right now, I needed to leave this building before the professional composure I was clinging to shattered into something messier. My car sat in the parking lot where I'd left it 3 hours ago, back when I was still a battalion commander with a spotless 30-year record and a future that looked like it might include stars of my own someday. Now, I was just another colonel with a reassignment pending and a sister who decided family loyalty mattered less than career advancement. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar roads and traffic lights that somehow felt foreign. Everything looked the same. Nothing was. My house appeared exactly as I'd left it that morning. Small, modest, the kind of place that screamed mid-level military salary and practical choices. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with appliances from the previous decade. I'd lived here for 6 years, and it had never bothered me before. Never felt like failure. Today it felt like evidence, proof that I'd played by rules that didn't protect people like me, that I'd trusted a system designed to reward compliance over competence, politics over performance. I set my keys in the dish by the door, the same spot I'd been setting them for 6 years, and stood in the kitchen staring at nothing in particular. The silence wasn't heavy. It just was. Present and unavoidable and completely indifferent to whatever emotions I might be processing. My phone sat on the counter, screen dark, no missed calls, no messages, no one reaching out to ask what happened or offer support or express confusion about how an officer with my record could be removed for something as nebulous as leadership approach. That made sense. In the military, you learned quickly that touching someone else's problem was a good way to inherit it. Better to stay invisible, keep your head down, wait for the dust to settle before deciding whether to acknowledge the existence of whoever got buried underneath. I poured water into a glass and drank it standing up, then opened my laptop. Not to write emails, not to draft complaints or mount defenses, or start building the kind of emotional response that would feel satisfying for about 10 minutes before making everything worse. I logged into the secure personnel portal and pulled up my official file. Everything sat exactly where it should. Evaluations spanning 3 decades, all rated excellent or superior. Appointment orders documenting every position, every promotion, every assignment. Awards and commendations. Letters of appreciation from commanders who'd valued my work enough to put it in writing. No counseling statements, no adverse actions, no paper trail suggesting anything resembling the persistent concerns Catherine had cited. The record was clean, perfect even, which meant Catherine's justification existed nowhere except in her own head and whatever verbal conversations she'd had with people who wouldn't put their concerns on paper. That gap mattered more than most people realized. In the military, documentation wasn't just procedure, it was proof. It was the difference between legitimate authority and arbitrary power. And Catherine had just exercised the latter while pretending it was the former. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the kitchen counter, letting the day replay in my head. Not the removal itself, which was already cataloged and filed away in the part of my brain that processed trauma later, but the context, the history, the long chain of decisions that had led to this specific moment in this specific kitchen, with this specific hollow feeling spreading through my chest. 30 years ago, I'd been 28 years old, newly married to Michael Blackwood, a Navy pilot with good instincts and better hands. We'd wanted children, planned for them, picked out names and imagined futures that involved soccer games and piano recitals and all the normal chaos of family life. But military careers didn't accommodate motherhood easily, and we decided to wait. Wait until we both had stable positions. Wait until deployment slowed down. Wait until the timing made sense. Michael died in a training accident when I was 29. Routine flight that turned catastrophic in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They gave me a folded flag and a widow's pension and condolences that sounded sincere, but couldn't change the fact that my husband was gone and our future had died with him. I was 3 months pregnant with Jessica when they buried him. 3 months along with the only child I would ever have, because after Michael there was no one else. No desire to replace him, no energy to start over. Just me and the baby and a career that suddenly felt like the only thing I had left to hold on to. Jessica arrived 6 months later, perfect and small and completely unaware that her father would never meet her. I took 12 weeks of maternity leave, then returned to duty because sitting at home alone with an infant felt worse than the structured demands of military life. My mother helped when she could. Daycare handled the rest. I learned to compartmentalize in ways that probably weren't healthy but kept everything functioning. Catherine, meanwhile, had married a general's son. No children by choice. Full focus on career advancement. She moved through ranks efficiently, collecting mentors and assignments that looked impressive on paper. By the time I made colonel, she was already wearing stars. We didn't talk about the difference in our trajectories. Didn't acknowledge that her path had been smoother, easier, less complicated by things like grief and single motherhood, and choices between career and family. She'd made her decisions. I'd made mine. Both seemed valid at the time. But somewhere along the way, Catherine had stopped being my sister and become my superior officer. The relationship calcified into something formal and distant, all professional courtesy and no personal warmth. I told myself it was normal, that family dynamics got complicated when rank entered the equation, that we'd reconnect later when careers mattered less and there was time for things like sisterhood. I'd been lying to myself. The truth was simpler and uglier. Catherine had always resented me, not for anything I'd done, but for who I was. The daughter our parents actually liked. The one who got love without having to perform for it. The one people chose even when I wasn't trying to win. Our father, an Army colonel who'd retired with more pride than pension, used to say Catherine would be a general someday. Always would be. Future tense, like it was destiny. Then he'd look at me and smile and say Diana will find her way, present tense, like I was already where I belonged. Catherine got the Harvard ROTC scholarship. I got state school and student loans. Catherine married into military aristocracy. I married an enlisted man who worked his way up to officer through sheer competence and determination. Catherine's wedding had 300 guests and a reception at a country club. Mine had 50 people in a base chapel and cake from the commissary. None of it had bothered me at the time. I loved Michael, loved the life we were building, didn't need validation from people who measured success in rank and connections. But it bothered Catherine. She'd worked harder, sacrificed more, played the game better, and people still chose me, still preferred my company, my straightforwardness, my refusal to perform competence instead of simply being competent. That resentment had been simmering for decades. I just hadn't realized it would eventually boil over into this. My phone buzzed, breaking the spiral of memory. A text from Jessica, my daughter, now 29 and living in Raleigh with her own daughter. The message was simple. "Mom," I heard. "Aunt Catherine called me." My stomach tightened. Of course Catherine had called. She wanted Jessica to talk sense into me, to smooth this over, to make sure I accepted reassignment gracefully without causing problems. I typed back, careful to keep emotion out of text. What did she say? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Jessica was choosing words carefully, which meant Catherine had said something that required careful response. Finally, the message came through. She wanted me to tell you not to make this a big deal, to just accept the reassignment and move on. She said it would be better for everyone. Better for everyone. Translation, better for Catherine. Better for her promotion timeline. Better for the narrative she was building where I quietly disappeared, and she continued her ascent unencumbered by inconvenient family complications. I stared at the screen, considering responses, then deleted everything I'd started typing and went with truth. I have no intention of making this anything other than what it is, but I also won't pretend it's something it isn't. Jessica's response came faster this time. Good, because I told her to go to hell. The words hit like physical impact. Jessica never cursed. She was a lawyer, polished and professional, someone who chose words with precision and avoided vulgarity even in casual conversation. Hearing this, even through text, meant Catherine had pushed her past restraint into anger. Another message followed before I could respond. "Mom, I'm tired of her. She never came to my graduation, never met Emma, never cared about anyone except herself. And now she's trying to destroy your career because she's jealous about Grandma's will? I'm done." There it was, the real reason, laid bare by someone who'd been watching from outside and could see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. Our mother had passed last month. 85 years old, sharp until the end, clear about what she wanted. The will reading had been 2 weeks ago, and I'd learned something I hadn't expected. Dad's savings, which Catherine assumed would be split equally, went mostly to me. 800,000 in bonds he'd accumulated over decades. The house in Charleston, worth over $1 million in today's market. Family heirlooms, military memorabilia. Everything except 200,000 for Catherine. Enough to be respectful, but nowhere near half. The lawyer had read the provisions with professional neutrality, but Mom's reasoning was attached in a handwritten letter. Catherine had been too busy for Dad's final months, too important to visit, too focused on her own career to sit with a dying man who just wanted his daughter nearby. I'd taken emergency leave, held Dad's hand, sang the old Army songs he loved even though my voice couldn't carry a tune. Been there when he stopped breathing, and stayed until the funeral home arrived. Mom noticed, Dad noticed, the will reflected that. Catherine had called me exactly once after the reading. 3 minutes of barely controlled fury disguised as concern about whether I understood the tax implications. Then nothing. Complete silence. Until today. Until she'd used her authority as my superior officer to remove me from command, 10 days after learning she'd been written out of the inheritance she'd considered rightfully hers. The connection was obvious, undeniable, and completely unprovable without Catherine admitting it, which she never would. I texted Jessica back, "Don't let this affect your relationship with her. She's still your aunt." The response came immediately. She stopped being my aunt when she became someone who punishes family for imagined slights. I'm not interested in maintaining relationships with people who abuse power. Pride swelled in my chest, unexpected and fierce. This was the daughter I'd raised, the woman who'd learned from watching me navigate systems designed to favor others, who understood that compliance wasn't the same as complicity, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to participate in someone else's narrative. We texted back and forth for another 10 minutes, Jessica's anger gradually cooling into something more strategic. She was a lawyer after all. She knew how to channel emotion into action. Finally, she asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mom, what are you going to do?" I looked at my laptop, still open to my personnel file. Thought about the clause I'd read in Catherine's office. About 30 years of documentation sitting in filing cabinets in this house. About how systems worked when someone actually forced them to follow their own rules. "The right thing," I typed, "whatever that turns out to be." "Do you need a lawyer?" "Maybe, but not yet. First, I need to let the system wake up on its own." Jessica sent back a question mark, and I could picture her expression. Confused, but willing to trust me, waiting for explanation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. I wrote. Let people dig their own graves, then simply step aside and watch them fall in. She sent back a single word, okay, then added, I love you, Mom, and I'm proud of you. The words hit harder than they should have. I'd been holding everything together through sheer force of will, refusing to let the reality of what had happened actually penetrate. But Jessica's pride, her uncomplicated love, her willingness to stand with me even when it cost her relationship with Catherine, cracked something open. I set the phone down before I could type anything that might undermine the composure I needed to maintain. Instead, I walked to the home office, really just the second bedroom I'd converted into workspace years ago. Filing cabinets lined one wall, 4 drawers full of documentation spanning 30 years. Everything I'd ever been taught mattered. Every order, every evaluation, every email that seemed significant at the time, every piece of paper that might someday prove I'd done my job correctly even when others claimed otherwise. People called it paranoia. I called it preparation. I'd learned the habit from a colonel I'd served under early in my career, a man who'd been quietly reassigned after refusing to participate in something questionable. He'd had no documentation to support his side of the story, and the official version had won by default. Before he left, he'd pulled me aside. Diana, he'd said, voice low and urgent, document everything. Not because you think you'll need it, because you won't know you need it until it's too late to get it. The system protects what's written down. Everything else is just memory and hearsay. I'd taken that lesson to heart, built it into habit. Every significant interaction got memorialized somehow. Meeting summaries, email confirmations, calendar invites that established who was present when decisions were made. Not plotting, not paranoia, just creating a footprint clear enough that if someone ever questioned what happened, the answer would already exist. Catherine thought I was careless, emotional, too focused on mission and people to worry about administrative details. She'd always been the organized one, the planner, the person who thought 3 moves ahead. She'd never noticed that I thought 4 moves ahead, just quietly, without announcing it. I pulled open the filing cabinet and ran my fingers across folder tabs. 30 years, 3 decades of proof that I'd done my job well, that I'd been valued, respected, considered exemplary by everyone who'd evaluated me. And nowhere, in all that documentation, was there anything supporting persistent concerns about my leadership approach. That discrepancy wasn't just significant, it was fatal, to Catherine's justification anyway, because the military ran on paper, on records and documentation and procedures that existed precisely to prevent people from exercising arbitrary authority. When those records contradicted official actions, the system had mechanisms to investigate. Usually those mechanisms stayed dormant because most people didn't read their removal orders carefully enough to know they existed. I'd read mine, knew exactly what I'd triggered by signing it. Now I just had to wait for the system to notice. The call came at 9 that evening, unknown number with a DC area code. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice neutral and professional. Colonel Blackwood. The voice on the other end was female, crisp, unfamiliar. Colonel Blackwood, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Park, Office of the Inspector General. We need to schedule an interview regarding your removal from command. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. This was expected, inevitable. The clause I'd read had language requiring formal review, and that review started with interviews. Of course, ma'am. When works for you? Tomorrow, 0900, can you come to the Pentagon? Yes, ma'am. There was a pause, the kind that suggested she was deciding whether to say something off script. Then, Colonel Blackwood, please bring any documentation you have related to performance evaluations, counseling statements, or communications with Major General Blackwood. The request was standard, routine, but something in her tone suggested she already suspected what she'd find, or more accurately, what she wouldn't find. I have 30 years of documentation, ma'am. Will 3 file boxes be sufficient? Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted from professional to carefully curious. Colonel Blackwood, you kept copies of everything? Yes, ma'am, everything. The silence stretched. I could hear her thinking, recalibrating, understanding that this wasn't going to be a simple interview where I showed up with a handful of evaluations and vague memories. Then yes, she said finally, that will be very sufficient. See you tomorrow, Colonel. The call ended. I set the phone down and looked at the filing cabinets again. Tomorrow, Someone from the Inspector General's office would see exactly what 30 years of careful documentation looked like. They'd see the gap between my actual record and Catherine's characterization. They'd start asking questions that Catherine wouldn't be able to answer without admitting she'd acted on personal motives rather than professional concerns. And once those questions started, they wouldn't stop. Because the military, for all its flaws, took documentation seriously, took the integrity of its system seriously. And when someone in Catherine's position appeared to have abused that system, consequences followed. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because allowing it to stand would undermine everything the institution claimed to represent. I spent the rest of the evening organizing boxes, not creating anything new, just pulling together what already existed. 30 years of evidence that I'd been exactly what every evaluation said I was. Competent, reliable, honest, effective. And nowhere in any of those 30 years was there documentation supporting the idea that my leadership approach had ever been a concern worth addressing. That absence would speak louder than anything I could say. By midnight, the boxes sat by the front door, ready to load into my car in the morning. 3 archive boxes containing the complete record of a career Catherine was trying to end with a single vague accusation. I poured one more glass of water, drank it slowly, then headed to bed. Tomorrow would be long, intense, possibly the beginning of something that would reshape both our careers in ways neither of us had fully anticipated. But tonight I needed sleep. I set my phone on the nightstand, volume up, not because I expected calls, but because when they came, I didn't want to miss them. The screen glowed in the darkness, casting shadows across walls I'd painted myself years ago, when this house had felt like home, rather than evidence of modest choices. Somewhere across Fort Bragg, Catherine was probably sleeping soundly, confident that she'd handled an inconvenient problem efficiently, that I'd accept reassignment quietly, that her promotion timeline remained intact. She'd underestimated me, assumed that being my sister gave her insight into who I was and what I'd accept, assumed that 30 years of watching me navigate military life had taught her my limits. What she'd actually learned was a carefully curated version of me. The professional, the competent officer, the woman who followed rules and trusted systems and believed that doing good work would be enough. She'd never seen the part that read everything, remembered everything, documented everything, the part that knew exactly how systems worked and how to make them work when needed. That part had been invisible by design, strategic obscurity, keeping the real capabilities hidden until the moment they mattered. Tomorrow they would matter. Tomorrow, the Inspector General would see what Catherine had missed. And somewhere in Washington, in offices designed to investigate exactly this kind of thing, people would start asking questions that had very uncomfortable answers. I closed my eyes and let exhaustion take over. The last thought before sleep was oddly peaceful. Silence could be strategy. Patience could be power. And sometimes the most devastating response to injustice was simply letting the truth speak for itself. Catherine had given me removal papers. I'd given her a formal review. Now we'd both have to live with the consequences of our choices. The Pentagon parking garage smelled like concrete and exhaust, familiar in the way all military installations carried the same industrial scent regardless of location. I'd driven 3 hours through pre-dawn darkness with those file boxes stacked in my passenger seat, each bump in the road making them shift slightly, their weight a physical reminder of what I was carrying. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Park's office occupied a corner of the Inspector General's suite on the 3rd floor, windows overlooking the river. She stood when I entered, extending a hand that gripped mine with the kind of firmness that suggested she'd learned early to compensate for being underestimated. The boxes drew her attention immediately. 3 standard archive containers, labels facing forward, organized by decade. Her eyes widened slightly before professional neutrality reasserted itself. I set them on our conference table one at a time, the cardboard making hollow sounds against wood. Box 1 hit with a thud. Box 2 followed. Box 3 completed the row. Sarah circled the table slowly, studying the labels without touching anything yet. Her silence felt deliberate, the kind lawyers used when they wanted witnesses to fill empty space with unnecessary words. I waited. Finally, she pulled the first box toward her and lifted the lid. Folders arranged chronologically, each spine marked with dates and brief descriptors. She pulled one at random, a performance evaluation from my 5th year of service. The pages crinkled as she turned them. Her finger traced down rating scales where every category showed marks in the highest columns. Comments from my rater filled the narrative section with language that couldn't be mistaken for anything but strong endorsement. She replaced that folder and selected another, then a third. Each time her expression shifted incrementally towards something I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe. Or recognition that whatever she'd expected to find wasn't matching what actually existed in front of her. Box 2 received the same treatment. Random selections, careful reading, the slow accumulation of evidence that contradicted the official reason for my removal. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an edge that hadn't been present during our phone call. Colonel Blackwood, in 30 years of service, how many formal counseling statements did you receive regarding leadership concerns? 0. How many letters of reprimand? 0. How many adverse officer evaluation reports? 0. Sarah closed the folder she'd been holding and looked at me directly. So there exists no documentary evidence supporting persistent concerns about your leadership approach? That's correct. She pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing, the pen moving across paper with quick precision. After filling half a page, she set it down and leaned back in her chair. Colonel Blackwood, I need to ask you something for the record. What is your relationship to Major General Catherine Blackwood? The question hung between us, heavy with implications I'd been anticipating since signing those removal papers. She's my sister, older by 4 years. Sarah's pen stopped moving. Her eyes lifted from the notepad to my face, searching for something. When she spoke again, each word came out carefully measured. Your sister removed you from command. Yes. The silence that followed felt different from earlier pauses. This one carried weight, the kind that accumulated when simple facts revealed complicated truths. Colonel, did you have any personal conflicts with General Blackwood prior to your removal? I considered how much to share, how far back to trace the roots of resentment that had finally bloomed into this. The inheritance seemed like the obvious trigger, but the foundation had been laid decades earlier. Our mother passed away last month. There was an inheritance situation. I received the majority of the estate. Catherine received substantially less than she expected. When did she learn about the distribution? 10 days before my removal. Sarah made another note, her handwriting growing sharper. Did General Blackwood ever discuss the inheritance with you in any professional capacity? No. She avoided speaking to me entirely after the will reading, except for the removal briefing. The pen moved faster now, filling lines with observations I couldn't see from my angle. When Sarah looked up again, her professional mask had developed cracks. Colonel Blackwood, I need to be direct with you. The absence of supporting documentation combined with the family relationship and timing creates serious questions about motive. This may expand beyond a simple administrative review. I understood what she wasn't saying directly. That Catherine's authority to remove me didn't shield her from scrutiny when the justification failed to align with my actual record. That family relationships complicated everything, especially when they intersected with professional decisions that looked increasingly personal. The interview continued for another hour. Sarah methodically worked through my career chronology, pulling files that documented assignments, deployments, awards, everything that constituted my official history. Each folder reinforced the same pattern: competence, reliability, leadership that earned respect rather than demanding it. When she finally closed the last box, her expression had settled into something grim. Colonel, I'll be conducting additional interviews over the next week. Your executive officer, your senior enlisted advisor, other officers who've worked with you. I need to build a complete picture. Of course. She stood, signaling the interview's end, but her posture suggested there was more she wanted to say without the recorder running. I waited until she switched off the device and set it aside. Off the record, Colonel. You knew exactly what you were doing when you signed that removal order, didn't you? The question didn't feel accusatory, more like professional recognition between people who understood how systems actually functioned beneath their official surfaces. I read the clause, understood its implications, decided the system should evaluate whether my removal met its own standards. Sarah nodded slowly. That takes either tremendous faith in the process or tremendous confidence in your documentation. Both. She walked me to the door, but her hand rested on the frame, preventing me from leaving quite yet. One more thing, Colonel. This investigation may uncover patterns beyond your specific case. If it does, things could get uncomfortable for people who thought their decisions wouldn't be questioned. I met her eyes directly. Good. Decisions that can't withstand questions shouldn't be made. The drive back to Fort Bragg felt longer than the morning journey. My mind replayed the interview, analyzing what Sarah had asked and what she'd carefully avoided asking. The expansion she'd hinted at suggested my removal wasn't isolated, that Catherine's exercise of authority might reveal habits worth examining. That possibility both vindicated and unsettled me. Vindication because it meant I wasn't paranoid or overly sensitive. Unsettled because discovering systematic problems meant more people had been hurt, and I'd been too focused on my own situation to notice theirs. My phone rang as I crossed into North Carolina. Marcus Rivera's name appeared on the screen. I answered on speaker, Sergeant Major. His voice came through tense. "Ma'am," IG called, "they want to interview me tomorrow morning, early." That was faster than expected. Sarah Park wasn't wasting time, which meant she'd already found enough in my documentation to justify expanding her investigation. "Tell them everything you know, Marcus. The truth, nothing embellished." "That's what worries me, ma'am. The truth isn't going to make the general look good." Then maybe the general should have acted differently. He exhaled heavily, a sound carrying 30 years of watching politics trump principle. "Ma'am, there's something else. 3 other soldiers contacted me, all women, all former officers who served under General Blackwood. They heard about your removal and want to talk." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. About what? About their own removals. Similar circumstances, vague justifications, no documentation. The pattern Sarah had alluded to was already materializing, emerging from shadows where it had hidden beneath professional language and career casualties. People accepted as normal attrition. "Get their contact information to IG, Marcus. They need to hear those stories." "Already done, ma'am. I figured you'd say that." The call ended, leaving me alone with implications that kept multiplying. If Catherine had done this to multiple officers, if she'd built a habit of removing women who questioned her decisions, then my case wasn't about sibling rivalry or inheritance disputes. It was about systematic abuse of authority hidden behind procedural language. That realization shifted something fundamental. This stopped being about my career and became about everyone who'd been quietly pushed aside before me. Fort Bragg appeared on the horizon, familiar skyline against afternoon clouds. I drove past the main gate toward housing, but detoured at the last minute toward the battalion area. Emily Chen deserved to know what was happening before rumors filled the gaps with speculation. Her office light was on, visible through windows that overlooked the motor pool. I climbed stairs that felt strange now that I had no official reason to be in this building. The hallway carried sounds of normal operations, voices discussing maintenance schedules and training requirements. The machinery of military life continuing regardless of who was in charge. Emily looked up when I knocked, surprise crossing her face before shifting into something more cautious. "Ma'am." "Captain, got a minute?" She gestured to the chair across from her desk, the same chair I'd sat in countless times for routine discussions that now felt like artifacts from another lifetime. The office looked different under her occupation. Files arranged slightly differently, coffee mug in a new spot, small changes that marked transition of authority. "IG is conducting interviews. They'll probably contact you soon." Emily nodded, unsurprised. Word travels fast in small communities. And military installations were nothing if not small communities where everyone's business became everyone else's knowledge. "I'll tell them what I observed, that you ran this battalion better than anyone I've served under. That soldiers trusted you because you never asked them to do things you wouldn't do yourself." The words landed with unexpected force. I'd spent 30 years building that kind of reputation, and hearing it articulated by someone who'd watched closely enough to recognize it mattered more than any official evaluation. "How are you holding up, Emily?" She paused before answering, choosing words carefully. "Honestly, ma'am, I'm angry. Not at you. At the whole situation. At how easily someone can destroy a career with nothing but vague accusations and convenient timing. That anger is valid. Just don't let it become something that damages your own career." Her laugh came out bitter. "That's the problem, isn't it? We're all supposed to just accept that power can be exercised arbitrarily as long as it's wrapped in appropriate language. That questioning decisions makes us difficult rather than diligent." I leaned forward, lowering my voice even though no one else was present. Emily, the system is questioning those decisions now, not because I demanded it, because the documentation doesn't support the action. That matters. Will it change anything? I don't know, but silence definitely won't. She studied me across the desk, evaluating something beyond my words. Finally, she reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. Ma'am, I need to show you something. After your removal, General Blackwood called me in privately. She suggested I could succeed where you'd failed if I learned to be more flexible about regulations. The phrase sent cold recognition through my chest. More flexible about regulations was exactly the kind of language Catherine used when she wanted compliance, without explicitly ordering violations. Did you document the conversation? Emily's smile held an edge I hadn't seen before. I recorded it. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. The implications detonated slowly. If Emily had Catherine on recording suggesting regulatory flexibility, it established pattern, proved that my refusal to falsify reports wasn't isolated, but part of Catherine's standard operating procedure. You need to give that recording to IG. Already sent it this morning. The pieces were accumulating faster than I'd anticipated. My documentation, Marcus's testimony, Emily's recording, the other women officers reaching out. Catherine had built her authority on the assumption that subordinates wouldn't compare notes, wouldn't coordinate, wouldn't recognize individual incidents as systematic behavior. That assumption was collapsing. I stood to leave, but Emily stopped me with a question that cut straight to the core. Ma'am, what do you want to happen here? Justice? Revenge? Your command back? The question deserved honest answer, even though I wasn't entirely sure myself. I want the system to work the way it claims to work, where authority requires justification, where decisions can be defended with documentation, where people can't be discarded because they're inconvenient. And Catherine? Emily's directness forced me to confront what I'd been avoiding. My sister had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who valued career advancement over integrity. But she was still the person who taught me to ride a bike, who'd protected me from bullies when we were children. Catherine made choices. Now she gets to live with consequences, same as anyone else. The drive home felt heavier than earlier. Knowing Emily had recordings, knowing other officers were coming forward, knowing the investigation was expanding beyond simple administrative review into something that would touch careers and reputations across multiple years. The weight of it settled into my shoulders. My phone buzzed repeatedly as I pulled into the driveway, text messages accumulating while I'd been driving. The first was from Jessica. Mom, Aunt Catherine called again. She's panicking. I stared at the screen, imagining my sister's reaction as she realized the quiet removal she'd orchestrated was metastasizing into formal investigation. Catherine's career had been built on control, on managing perceptions, on ensuring outcomes aligned with her carefully constructed narrative. That control was slipping. The next message came from a number I didn't recognize, but the area code placed it in Washington State. Colonel Blackwood, this is Captain Jennifer Martinez. We've never met, but I served under your sister 3 years ago. I was removed for being too aggressive. I'd like to talk. Then another unfamiliar number. Colonel Rachel Park here. Removed 2 years ago for lacking command presence. I saw your removal listed in the daily report and thought you should know you're not the first. The pattern was undeniable now. Women officers with excellent records, removed for vague reasons that sounded professional but lacked substance. Each one probably thought they were isolated cases, personal failures, individual deficiencies. Together they formed something else entirely. Evidence of systematic discrimination hidden behind acceptable language. I forwarded both messages to Sarah Park with a brief note. Additional officers who may have relevant information. Her response came within minutes. Thank you. We're already tracking similar cases. Current count is 8 potential instances over 5 years. All women. All excellent records, all removed without proper documentation. 8. The number hit like physical blow. 8 careers disrupted. 8 officers told they weren't good enough when the real problem was they'd been too competent, too questioning, too unwilling to comply with questionable directives. How had I missed this? How had any of us missed it? But I knew the answer. We'd all been focused on our own situations, our own commands, our own struggles to succeed in an environment that demanded more from women while claiming equal standards. We hadn't connected the dots because the dots were scattered across different units, different time periods, different circumstances. Catherine had counted on that isolation, on each woman thinking she'd failed individually rather than recognizing she'd been systematically targeted. That calculation was failing now. My phone rang. Catherine's number appeared on screen, the first direct contact since the removal briefing. I let it ring 4 times before answering, keeping my voice neutral. General. Her voice came through tight, controlled, barely containing whatever was churning underneath. Diana, we need to talk. This doesn't have to become a legal issue. The informal tone after days of silence felt calculated. She was reaching for the sister relationship now, trying to activate family loyalty she'd discarded when it suited her purposes. I've been advised not to discuss this matter with you. I'm not calling as your commanding officer. I'm calling as your sister. The distinction felt meaningless. She'd chosen to be my commanding officer when it served her interests. Choosing to be my sister now that legal pressure was building didn't erase that calculation. Catherine, you removed me from command using authority you had as a general, not as family. This investigation is examining that professional decision. Mixing family into it now just complicates things. Static filled the line, her breathing audible but words not coming. Finally, tightly controlled. This is getting out of hand. People are asking questions that don't need to be asked. Maybe they do need to be asked. Maybe they should have been asked a long time ago. Her voice sharpened, control fraying. You're going to destroy my career over an inheritance dispute? The accusation landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Trying to make this about money, about sibling rivalry, about anything except the pattern of authority abuse that predated Mom's death by years. This isn't about inheritance. It's about documentation. It's about whether your decisions can withstand scrutiny. Apparently they can't. Silence stretched, longer this time. When she spoke again, the control had fractured completely. You think you're so righteous, so principled, but you're just weak, Diana. You always were. Too soft to make hard decisions. Too concerned with being liked to be effective. The words should have hurt, would have hurt, once. But they revealed more about Catherine than about me. If caring about people makes me weak, then I'll take that weakness over whatever strength you think you have. She hung up without responding. I set the phone down and watched it like it might ring again. Might deliver another attempt at manipulation disguised as reconciliation. It stayed silent. That evening, Jessica arrived with Emma, my granddaughter's energy filling the small house with the kind of chaos that made everything else feel less heavy. At 4 years old, Emma's understanding of adult complications remained blissfully limited. She knew Grandma had a hard day, knew that meant extra pancakes for dinner, knew that sometimes grown-ups needed hugs that lasted longer than usual. Jessica waited until Emma was absorbed in coloring books before asking the question I knew was coming. How bad is it going to get? I considered sugarcoating, but Jessica was a lawyer. She dealt with investigations professionally. She deserved honest assessment. IG has identified 8 other cases, all women, all removed by Catherine with insufficient justification. They're examining whether it constitutes a pattern of discrimination. Jessica's expression shifted from concerned to professionally analytical. 8 cases over how many years? 5. Her mind worked through implications visible in the way her eyes tracked across invisible calculations. That's not isolated decisions, that's systematic behavior. Exactly what IG is concluding. Mom, this could destroy her. Not just career. Criminal charges are possible if they find evidence of intentional discrimination. The possibility had occurred to me, hovering at the edges of thoughts I'd been avoiding confronting directly. Catherine hadn't just made bad decisions. She'd potentially violated federal law, abused authority in ways that carried consequences beyond reassignment or retirement. How do you feel about that? Jessica's question echoed Emily's earlier, forcing me to articulate something I'd rather leave unexamined. I feel sad, not triumphant, not vindicated, just sad that it came to this. Emma looked up from her coloring. Mommy, why is Grandma sad? Jessica knelt beside her daughter, finding language appropriate for a 4-year-old's understanding. Because sometimes people we love make bad choices, sweetheart. And those choices hurt people. Like when I took Sophie's toy? Emma had recently navigated a playground incident involving disputed ownership of a plastic shovel. The comparison was simplistic, but captured essential truth. Similar, baby. Except Grandma's sister took something more important than a toy. What did she take? Jessica glanced at me, uncertain how to translate command removal into preschool terms. I stepped in. She took something I worked very hard for, Emma. Something I earned by doing good work for a long time. It's not fair. The simple statement from a 4-year-old cut through legal complexity and political calculation to reach bedrock truth. No, sweetie, it wasn't fair. Are you going to take it back? The question assumed justice worked like playground disputes, where adults intervened and made things right. Reality was messier, but Emma's expectation reflected what systems claim to provide. I'm letting grown-ups whose job is fairness decide what should happen. Emma considered this, her face serious in the way children's faces got when processing concepts just beyond their grasp. Then she returned to coloring. The matter settled in her mind, if not in reality. Jessica stayed after Emma went to bed, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with tea. Neither of us was drinking. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. If they offer you a deal, if Catherine agrees to retire quietly, and they restore your record without public investigation, would you take it? The hypothetical felt too plausible. Organizations preferred quiet resolutions, outcomes that protected institutional reputation, while addressing individual grievances. Offering me my career back in exchange for letting Catherine exit gracefully would solve everyone's problems, except the 8 other women who'd been pushed aside, except the next generation of officers who'd face the same systematic pressure if patterns went unaddressed. No, I wouldn't take that deal. Even knowing it means Catherine faces court-martial, criminal charges, prison potentially. Jessica's directness forced me to confront the full weight of consequences my documentation had set in motion, even then. Because this isn't about Catherine anymore. It's about whether the system protects people or just protects itself. She nodded slowly, lawyer's mind recognizing the principle, even while human heart struggled with implications. Aunt Catherine called me yesterday, before she called you. What did she want? She wanted me to convince you to drop this, to accept a deal, to let her retire with dignity. Jessica's expression hardened in ways I recognized from watching her navigate hostile depositions. I told her dignity isn't something you get to keep when you've built your career on taking it from others. The words hung between us, final and unforgiving. Jessica had made her choice, aligned herself with principle over family comfort. That alignment cost her too, severing relationships she'd maintained despite Catherine's absence. I'm sorry you're caught in this. She reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. I'm not caught, Mom. I chose. There's a difference. The week that followed moved with mechanical inevitability. IG interviewed Marcus Rivera, who testified about my leadership with the kind of specificity that came from 6 years of close observation. They interviewed Emily Chen, who provided not just testimony, but recordings that established Catherine's pattern of pressuring subordinates toward regulatory flexibility. They interviewed the 8 other women officers, each story adding detail to a picture that became clearer with every statement. Pattern emerged from individual data points. What had looked like isolated decisions revealed itself as systematic targeting of women who demonstrated competence, combined with unwillingness to comply. Sarah Park called on Friday with an update delivered in carefully neutral language that couldn't quite hide the gravity underneath. Colonel Blackwood, I need to inform you that this investigation has expanded beyond administrative review. We're now examining potential violations of Title VII, Article 92 of UCMJ, and conduct unbecoming charges. The legal citations carried weight I didn't need law school to understand. Title VII covered employment discrimination. Article 92 addressed failure to obey lawful orders and regulations. Conduct unbecoming was the catch-all for behavior that undermined military standards. Together they spelled court-martial. Has General Blackwood been informed? She was notified this morning. She's been assigned defense counsel and advised of her rights. Sarah's tone suggested there was more. Information she was deciding whether to share. I waited through the silence. Colonel, there's something else. During our investigation, we discovered communications between General Blackwood and 3 other general officers. It appears they had an arrangement. What kind of arrangement? Sarah's hesitation felt significant. They would support each other's promotions and protect each other's decisions in exchange for removing officers who created problems for their command climate. The implications detonated slowly. Catherine hadn't been acting alone. She'd been part of a network. Generals protecting each other's authority by eliminating subordinates who questioned them. My refusal to sign false reports hadn't just threatened Catherine. It had threatened the entire structure of mutual protection they'd built. How high does this go? That's what we're determining now, but Colonel, you should know that your documentation, your willingness to let the system examine what happened, you've uncovered something significantly larger than one questionable removal. I thought about those 8 women, thought about how many more might exist in files we hadn't examined yet, thought about the culture that allowed this to happen, that valued compliance over competence, that punished integrity as troublemaking. What happens now? Formal charges will be filed next week. Article 32 hearing to determine if evidence supports court-martial. You'll likely be called as a witness. The timeline felt both too fast and not fast enough. Too fast because it meant Catherine's entire career would collapse in the space between 1 week and the next. Not fast enough because every day that passed meant more opportunities for political intervention, for quiet deals that protected powerful people at the expense of systemic change. Colonel Park, I have one question. Go ahead. The 8 women who were removed before me, will they be vindicated too? Sarah's voice softened slightly, professional distance giving way to something more human. That's the goal. Full record restoration for everyone who was targeted, along with policy changes to prevent this from happening again. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table watching afternoon light fade into evening. Somewhere in Washington, Catherine was meeting with defense counsel, learning that her career was ending in the worst possible way. Not quiet retirement with pension intact, but court-martial, potential conviction, disgrace that would follow her permanently. Part of me, the part that remembered childhood protection and sisterly affection, felt genuine sorrow. The other part, the part that had spent 30 years watching women get pushed aside for being competent and principled, felt something harder. Not satisfaction exactly. More like recognition that consequences were finally catching up to choices. My phone buzzed. Text from Jessica. It's on the news. General Catherine Blackwood under investigation for discrimination and abuse of authority. They're calling it systematic. Mom, are you okay? I stared at the message, trying to identify what I actually felt beneath the complexity. I'm okay, I typed back. Sad, but okay. This needed to happen. Emma wants to know if you're still coming to her dance recital tomorrow. The question grounded me, pulled me back from abstract principles and legal proceedings into the concrete reality of a 4-year-old who'd been practicing ballet moves in my living room for weeks. Wouldn't miss it. Because that was the truth. Catherine's consequences were hers to manage. My life continued, granddaughter's recitals and all, regardless of what happened in courtrooms and investigation offices. The system was working now, grinding through its processes with mechanical precision. My role was essentially complete. I'd provided documentation, given testimony, let truth speak without embellishment or manipulation. Everything else would unfold according to procedures designed precisely for situations like this, where authority met accountability, and one of them had to give way. I suspected I knew which one would bend. The Article 32 hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March, 8 weeks after my removal. The military justice system moved slowly by design. Methodical accumulation of evidence and testimony that would either support or dismiss charges serious enough to end careers and potentially result in prison time. I'd been to the Pentagon dozens of times throughout my career, but never for anything like this. The hearing room occupied secure space on the 4th floor, windows covered with blinds that blocked outside light and created an environment where only artificial illumination existed. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting everyone in the same harsh pallor that made distinguishing guilt from innocence purely a matter of evidence rather than appearance. Catherine sat at the defense table with Colonel Marcus Bennett, a JAG officer whose reputation for aggressive defense tactics preceded him. She wore her dress uniform, ribbons and badges perfectly aligned, hair pulled back in the regulation bun. From a distance, she looked exactly like what she'd always been, a general officer whose career trajectory had been flawless until 2 months ago, when documentation began contradicting authority. I sat in the witness section with Sarah Park, who'd transitioned from investigator to trial counsel as the case evolved from administrative review to formal charges. The transformation had been seamless, her investigative thoroughness translating directly into prosecutorial precision. The presiding officer was Colonel William Torres, a JAG with 28 years of experience, and a reputation for running hearings by strict interpretation of military law. He called the room to order with a gavel that made surprisingly little sound against wood. This Article 32 hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to refer charges against Major General Catherine Blackwood to General Court-Martial. The charges include violations of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Catherine's face remained neutral, but I saw her jaw tighten. Hearing charges read aloud transformed abstract legal proceedings into concrete accusations. Sarah stood, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed without sounding rehearsed. The government alleges that Major General Blackwood engaged in systematic discrimination against female officers under her command, removing or reassigning 9 officers over a 5-year period, using vague justifications unsupported by required documentation. The government further alleges these actions violated regulatory standards, demonstrated abuse of authority, and constituted conduct unbecoming an officer. Bennett objected immediately, his voice sharp and confident. The defense disputes these characterizations entirely. General Blackwood exercised lawful command authority in each instance, making difficult personnel decisions based on professional judgment and operational requirements. Torres nodded, unsurprised by the objection. Noted. Counsel, call your first witness. Sarah looked at me. The government calls Colonel Diana Blackwood. The walk to the witness stand felt longer than the actual distance, each step observed by people whose judgments would determine outcomes for everyone involved. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell truth, a promise I'd already been keeping for 30 years, but now formalized under oath. Sarah began with background questions, establishing my career chronology and relationship to Catherine. The answers came easily because they were simply facts, dates and assignments and evaluations that existed in official records regardless of how anyone interpreted them. Then she moved to specifics. Colonel Blackwood, please describe the events leading to your removal from command. I recounted the briefing room, Catherine's announcement, the vague justification that matched nothing in my actual record. Sarah let me speak without interruption, allowing the narrative to build naturally rather than fragmenting it with questions. When I finished, she asked the critical question, Colonel, did you ever receive formal counseling regarding your leadership approach? No. Written warnings? No. Adverse evaluations? No. So there exists no documentary evidence supporting the stated reason for your removal? Correct. Sarah pulled a folder from her table and handed it to me. Colonel, is this your complete personnel file covering 30 years of service? Yes. Please show the court any documentation supporting General Blackwood's characterization of persistent concerns about your leadership. I opened the folder, made a show of looking through pages I'd already memorized. The silence stretched deliberately, theatrically, making the absence of evidence more powerful than presence would have been. There is none. Bennett stood for cross-examination, his approach more aggressive than Sarah's measured pace. Colonel Blackwood, isn't it true that you had personal conflicts with General Blackwood outside your professional relationship? We had family disagreements, yes, including about your mother's estate. My mother chose to leave me more in her will. Catherine disagreed with that choice. And this personal animosity might color your testimony here today? I met his eyes directly, keeping my voice level. My testimony consists of documented facts. Facts don't change based on personal feelings. But your interpretation of those facts might? The documentation speaks for itself. I'm simply providing context for what already exists in official records. Bennett tried several more angles, attempting to establish bias or motive for exaggerating Catherine's actions. Each time I redirected to documentation, to the gap between official justification and actual record. Finally, Torres intervened. Counsel, Colonel Blackwood's testimony has been consistent with documentary evidence. Unless you have new lines of questioning, we'll move on. Bennett sat down, frustration visible in the stiffness of his posture. Sarah called Marcus Rivera next. He'd worn his dress uniform despite being retired now, the ribbon spanning his chest telling the story of 28 years serving people like me. Sergeant Major Rivera, you served under Colonel Blackwood for 6 years as her senior enlisted advisor? Yes, ma'am. Describe her leadership style. Marcus didn't hesitate. Direct, fair, demanding, but supportive. She held people to high standards and gave them the tools to meet those standards. Did you ever witness behavior warranting removal from command? Never. I witnessed the opposite. Leadership that earned respect through competence rather than demanding it through rank. Sarah handed him a document. Do you recognize this? Marcus scanned it, nodding. It's a readiness report Colonel Blackwood refused to sign 6 months before her removal. Why did she refuse? Because it overstated our unit's capabilities. She explained to General Blackwood that false readiness affects deployment decisions. If we're sent into combat based on inflated assessments, soldiers die. How did General Blackwood respond? She told Colonel Blackwood she was making things difficult and not thinking about the big picture. Did Colonel Blackwood comply with the order to sign a false report? No, ma'am. She submitted an accurate report through alternate channels. Sarah's voice sharpened. Did General Blackwood retaliate for that refusal? Marcus looked at Catherine directly. 3 weeks later, I started hearing concerns about Colonel Blackwood's leadership approach. Vague comments, no specifics, no documentation. 6 months after that, she was removed from command. Bennett's cross-examination focused on whether Marcus could definitively prove causation between the report refusal and removal. Marcus held firm, pointing out that correlation combined with timing and lack of alternative explanations suggested clear connection. Emily Chen testified next, her youth making the testimony more powerful. At 32, she represented the next generation, watching how the system treated women who demonstrated competence. Captain Chen, what happened after Colonel Blackwood was removed and you assumed command? General Blackwood called me in privately. She congratulated me and suggested I could succeed where Colonel Blackwood had failed if I learned to be more flexible about regulations. Sarah paused, letting that phrase hang. Did you understand what she meant by flexible about regulations? Yes, ma'am. She wanted me to prioritize compliance with her directives over strict adherence to written standards. Did you comply? No, ma'am. Colonel Blackwood taught me that rank doesn't absolve us of moral responsibility, that following illegal or unethical orders makes us complicit regardless of who gave them. What happened when you didn't comply? I was removed from command 3 weeks later. Same justification. Leadership approach concerns, no documentation. The pattern was building, each witness adding another layer until the structure became undeniable. Sarah called Jennifer Martinez, one of the 8 women officers Catherine had removed before me. Jennifer's testimony echoed Emily's with different specifics. Same systematic approach. Rachel Park followed, then 3 more women, each telling variations of the same story. Excellent performance records. Questioned Catherine's decisions. Removed without proper documentation. By the 4th testimony, even Bennett had stopped objecting to relevance. The pattern was too clear, too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Sarah's final witness before lunch recess was Brigadier General Robert Chen, a senior officer outside Catherine's chain of command who'd watched the pattern develop. General Chen, did Major General Blackwood ever discuss her personnel decisions with you? Yes. 2 years ago, she approached me about supporting her 3-star nomination. In exchange, she offered to handle some problematic officers in my division. What did you understand problematic to mean? Officers who questioned decisions, raised concerns about procedures, generally made command more complicated than she preferred. Did you agree to this arrangement? No. I told her the military doesn't work through backroom deals and personnel trades. How did she respond? She implied I was naive, that this was standard practice at senior levels. Did you report this conversation? I should have. I didn't. That's my failure, and I take responsibility for it. The honesty hit harder than deflection would have. A general officer admitting he'd witnessed potential corruption and failed to report it added credibility rather than undermining it. The lunch recess gave everyone time to process the morning's testimony. I sat in a small conference room with Sarah, picking at a sandwich I had no appetite for. How do you think it's going? Sarah's expression suggested cautious optimism. The pattern is clear. Multiple witnesses, documentary evidence, your sister's own recorded words suggesting regulatory flexibility. Torres would have to ignore substantial evidence to dismiss charges. What about the defense? Bennett's strategy seems to be attacking individual testimonies rather than addressing the systematic pattern. That might work if we had 1 or 2 witnesses. With 8, plus your documentation and Emily's recording, it's harder to dismiss. The afternoon session began with Catherine's defense. Bennett called character witnesses, officers who'd served with Catherine and praised her leadership. Each described her as demanding but fair, focused on mission accomplishment, dedicated to the Army's values. Sarah's cross-examination was surgical. Did you ever witness General Blackwood remove a female officer from command? The answers varied, but several admitted they had. Did those removals include proper documentation? Most couldn't say, hadn't reviewed the files. The testimony established Catherine's competence in many areas, while failing to address the specific allegations. Bennett had chosen to defend her general reputation rather than tackle the documented pattern, a strategic decision that suggested he knew the evidence was too strong to confront directly. Torres called a brief recess, then addressed the room. Does the defense wish to call Major General Blackwood to testify? Bennett conferred with Catherine in whispers that lasted longer than seemed comfortable. Finally, he stood. Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Major General Catherine Blackwood. Catherine took the stand with the same composed confidence she'd worn throughout the proceedings. Bennett led her through prepared testimony about command decisions, operational requirements, the difficult balance between unit needs and individual careers. Then Sarah stood for cross-examination, and the careful control began cracking. General Blackwood, you removed 9 female officers over 5 years, correct? Catherine's jaw tightened. I made personnel decisions regarding 9 officers who happened to be female. Did any of those 9 receive formal counseling before removal? Pause. Not all situations require formal counseling. Did any receive written warnings? Longer pause. Some concerns are better addressed through verbal guidance. So the answer is no. Catherine's hands clenched on the witness stand rail. The answer is that command decisions don't always fit neat administrative categories. Sarah pulled out a document. General, is this a readiness report you ordered Colonel Blackwood to sign 6 months before her removal? Yes. Does it accurately reflect unit readiness? It reflects operational assessments made by qualified personnel. That's not what I asked. Does it accurately reflect actual unit capabilities? Catherine's composure fractured visibly. It reflects the assessment that would have allowed us to meet mission requirements. Sarah's voice sharpened. By overstating readiness, by potentially sending soldiers into combat situations they weren't prepared for, we had to balance multiple priorities: operational demands, resource constraints. Answer the question, General. Did this report overstate your unit's readiness? The silence stretched. Everyone in the room understood what hung on Catherine's answer. Admission meant confirming my reason for refusing to sign. Denial meant contradicting documentary evidence. It may have presented capabilities more optimistically than Colonel Blackwood preferred. And when she refused to sign this optimistic presentation, you removed her from command? The removal was based on broader concerns about her leadership approach. Concerns you never documented? Catherine's control shattered. Not everything needs documentation. Sometimes decisions are based on judgment, on knowing when someone isn't the right fit, on recognizing when a subordinate has become more focused on being right than being effective. The outburst hung in the stunned silence that followed. Bennett's face went pale. Torres's expression remained neutral, but his pen moved across his notepad with quick strokes. Sarah's voice stayed level. General, did you remove Colonel Blackwood because she refused to falsify a readiness report? No. Did you remove her because she inherited more from your mother than you expected? Catherine's face flushed. That had nothing to do with it. Then why? What documented concerns justified removing an officer with a spotless 30-year record? Because she wouldn't... Catherine's voice cracked. Because she wouldn't understand that survival at senior levels requires compromise, that purity isn't practical, that being right all the time makes you dangerous to people trying to navigate complex realities. The confession spilled out before she could stop it, raw and honest and completely damning. So you removed her because she had integrity you found inconvenient? I removed her because her integrity made my job harder. Silence crashed down. Even Bennett had frozen, recognizing his client had just destroyed her own defense. Torres called recess, his expression grim. We'll reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments and findings. That evening, I sat with Jessica and Emma in my kitchen, the hearing's weight settling like physical pressure. Emma, oblivious to adult complications, chattered about her upcoming dance recital. Grandma, will you really come? You promise? I promise, sweetheart. Nothing could keep me away. Jessica waited until Emma was in bed before asking the question written across her face. That was bad, wasn't it? For Catherine. I thought about my sister's breakdown on the stand, the admission that integrity was inconvenient, the confession that she'd removed me not for failure, but for refusing to compromise principles. Yes, that was very bad. Do you feel guilty? The question deserved honest consideration. Did I feel guilty for setting events in motion that would end Catherine's career? possibly send her to prison, definitely destroy the reputation she'd spent 30 years building. I feel sad. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just sad that it came to this. Jessica nodded slowly. Emma asked me today why Great Aunt Catherine was sad. I didn't know how to explain that sometimes people create their own sadness. Tell her the truth. Age-appropriate version. That choices have consequences. That when we hurt people, even with good intentions, we have to accept responsibility. The next morning, Torres delivered his findings with the same neutral precision he'd maintained throughout. After reviewing testimony and documentary evidence, this court finds sufficient cause to refer charges against Major General Catherine Blackwood to General Court-Martial. Specifically, the evidence supports allegations of systematic discrimination, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He continued, detailing recommended restrictions on Catherine's authority pending court-martial. But I stopped tracking specifics. The decision had been made. The system, for all its flaws, had examined the evidence and concluded that authority without accountability was unacceptable. Sarah touched my arm as people began filing out. There's one more thing. The Secretary of the Army has ordered a comprehensive review of all personnel decisions made by the officers involved in the protection network we discovered. That's potentially hundreds of cases over the past decade. How many people were hurt? We don't know yet. But because you stood up, because you let the system work, we're going to find out, and we're going to try to make it right. 3 months later, on a June morning that felt nothing like the January day when this began, I stood in a ceremony room at Fort Bragg, receiving formal restoration of my record and promotion to Brigadier General. Jessica pinned the star on my shoulder, while Emma watched with wide eyes. "Mommy, Grandma has a star now." "Yes, baby, because she did the right thing even when it was hard." The Secretary of the Army, a 3-star general whose stern expression softened slightly as he addressed the room, spoke about integrity and accountability. "Your new assignment, General Blackwood, will be with the Inspector General's office. Specifically, you'll oversee implementation of new policies regarding command removals and discrimination prevention." The assignment felt like justice's final symmetry. I'd been removed unjustly. Now I'd help ensure others wouldn't face the same. That evening, as I was packing files from my temporary office, Catherine appeared in the doorway. She'd been released on bail pending court-martial, restricted to the D.C. area but allowed limited movement. We hadn't spoken since her testimony. Looking at her now, in civilian clothes because she'd been suspended from duty, I saw someone simultaneously familiar and foreign. "Diana." "Catherine. I came to say—" She paused, searching for words. "I came to say I'm sorry. Not because my lawyer told me to, because I mean it." I set down the file I'd been holding. "What are you sorry for?" "All of it, removing you. The other women, building a career on compromises that turned into corruption so gradually I didn't notice until it was too late." The apology felt genuine, but I'd learned not to trust surface appearances. "Catherine, I appreciate that. But apologies don't undo harm. Those 8 women, 9 including me, we lost time, opportunities, portions of careers we can never recover." "I know." She looked smaller somehow, diminished by consequences she couldn't control or manipulate. "I'm testifying against the others, the generals in the protection network, full cooperation with prosecutors." "Why?" "Because Mom was right." The words came out barely above whisper. "She told me before she died that I'd built success on sand. That when it collapsed, I'd have nothing solid to stand on." She was right. "What will you do after?" "If I avoid prison, I don't know. Something that doesn't require people to trust me with authority. Something that lets me earn back small amounts of dignity." The vulnerability felt real, but I couldn't let it override the reality of what she'd done. "Catherine, I don't hate you, but I can't forgive you yet. Maybe someday, not today." She nodded, accepting that. "I don't deserve forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that watching you stand firm while I collapsed taught me something I should have learned 30 years ago. That integrity isn't weakness. It's the only real strength." She left without waiting for response, and I let her go. 4 months passed. The court-martial resulted in conviction on discrimination charges, conduct unbecoming, and obstruction of justice. Catherine received reduction to colonel, forfeiture of most retirement benefits, and 2 years in military prison with possibility of parole after 18 months. The three other generals in the protection network faced similar charges, their cases winding through military justice with varying outcomes but consistent theme. Abuse of authority wouldn't be tolerated regardless of rank. The Secretary of Defense ordered comprehensive policy reforms. All command removals now required documented cause reviewed by independent boards. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. Annual audits would examine personnel decisions for patterns suggesting discrimination. 23 additional officers, women who'd been quietly pushed aside over the past decade, received record restorations and compensation. Their stories became part of the official record, evidence of systematic problems that had been allowed to persist because challenging them seemed more dangerous than accepting them. On a crisp October morning, I sat in my new office overlooking the Potomac, reviewing implementation progress on the policy reforms. Emma, now 5 and starting kindergarten, had visited the day before with Jessica. "Grandma?" she'd asked while coloring at my desk. "Are you famous?" I'd laughed at the question. "No, sweetheart, I'm just doing my job." "But you have a star and you're on TV sometimes." "That's because I helped make rules fairer. That's part of my job now." She'd considered this with the seriousness 5-year-olds brought to processing complex concepts. "When I grow up, I want to make rules fairer too." "Then you'll need to remember something important." "What?" "That making things fair means being brave even when it's scary. It means telling the truth even when lying would be easier. And it means caring about people you'll never meet, who need someone to stand up for them." Emma had nodded solemnly, then returned to her coloring. The lesson might not stick immediately, but seeds planted early sometimes grew in unexpected directions. A knock on my door pulled me from memory. Marcus Rivera entered, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the same bearing he'd had in uniform. "General Blackwood." Still feels weird saying that. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Marcus, you're retired. You can call me Diana." He sat, grinning. "Not a chance, ma'am. Some habits run too deep." We discussed the mentorship program we were developing. Initiative designed to teach young officers about documentation, advocacy, and navigating systems that sometimes worked against integrity rather than for it. After an hour of planning, Marcus stood to leave, then paused. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead. Do you ever regret it, starting all this? If you could go back, knowing what it cost your family, would you do it differently?" I thought about Catherine in prison, about family dinners that would never happen again, about Emma growing up knowing her great-aunt was in prison for crimes that sounded abstract to a 5-year-old, but had hurt real people. Then I thought about 23 officers whose records were restored, about policy changes that would protect future generations, about a system that worked because someone forced it to examine itself. No regrets, Marcus. Sadness about how things ended with Catherine, yes. But regret? No. Because this was never about revenge or vindication. It was about making the system honor its own values. He nodded, understanding in his expression. "That's what I thought you'd say. That's why you're the right person for this job." After he left, I stood at my window watching the river flow past. Somewhere in military prison, Catherine was learning what life looked like without authority to hide behind. Somewhere across the country, women officers were commanding units without fear of arbitrary removal. Somewhere in the future, Emma and her generation would inherit a military that had been forced to choose between protecting power and protecting people. It had chosen people. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. My phone buzzed. Text from Jessica. "Emma's teacher says she told the class today that rules should be fair, and her grandma makes sure they are." I may have cried a little. I typed back, "Tell her I'm proud of her, and tell her someday, when she's old enough to understand, I'll explain why fairness sometimes costs more than we expect, but is always worth the price." The reply came quickly. "She already knows, Mom. She learned it from watching you." I set the phone down and returned to the policy documents spread across my desk. There was work to do, reforms to implement, a system to improve incrementally because dramatic change rarely lasted. But the foundation had shifted. Authority no longer trumped accountability automatically. Documentation mattered more than rank. Integrity, for the first time in a long time, wasn't just a value written in manuals, but enforced in practice. Catherine had asked me once, in the moment her control fractured, whether I thought purity was practical. The answer, I understood now, wasn't about purity. It was about principle, about drawing lines that couldn't be crossed regardless of convenience, about accepting that some compromises corrupted while others merely complicated. The difference mattered, and teaching people to recognize that difference, to choose principle over expedience when it counted most, that was the work that remained. Outside my window, the sun set over Washington in shades of orange and gold. Another day ending. Another day closer to the military. Catherine and I had both sworn to serve actually living up to the values it claimed, not because anyone had forced it to with loud protests or dramatic confrontations, but because one colonel had read a clause carefully, documented thoroughly, and trusted that truth, when given space to speak, could be louder than any shout. That was enough.